Family loyalty has a price, and for the Pendleton dynasty, it was exactly 50 acres of rotting timber and poisoned soil. They laughed when the illegitimate daughter inherited the family's biggest financial sinkhole. They stopped laughing when she unearthed a secret that would dismantle their empire overnight. The mahogany-paneled conference room at Gable & Associates in Midtown Manhattan felt less like a place of legal business and more like an execution chamber. Clara Jenkins sat at the far edge of the sprawling table, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore her best blazer, though the frayed cuffs and slight fading at the elbows stood in stark contrast to the tailored Italian suits and diamond-studded watches surrounding her. Across from her sat Arthur Pendleton, her older half-brother, his legs casually crossed, swirling a glass of sparkling water, as if he were at a country club mixer rather than their father's will-reading. Next to him was his wife, Beatrice, a woman whose tight, surgical smile suggested she smelled something foul. To them, Clara was the foul thing, the living, breathing evidence of Harrison Pendleton's single indiscretion 32 years ago. Richard Gable, the elderly attorney who had managed Harrison's sprawling estate for decades, adjusted his reading glasses and cleared his throat. The room fell silent. "We are here today to execute the final wishes of Harrison Wyatt Pendleton," Gable began, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. Clara held her breath. She didn't want millions. She didn't want a seat on the board of Pendleton Industries. All she desperately needed was enough to pay off the crushing medical debt her mother, Evelyn, had left behind after a brutal 3-year battle with pancreatic cancer. A few $1,000s. That was all she prayed for. Harrison had never been a father to her, had never sent a birthday card or attended a graduation, but he had forced her to be present today. Surely there was a reason. "To my eldest and only legitimate son, Arthur," Gable read, emphasizing the word legitimate with a subtle glance over his spectacles, "I leave the entirety of my voting shares in Pendleton Holdings, the Tribeca penthouse, the estate in Southampton, and the liquid assets held in the Cayman and Swiss accounts. The total estimated value is roughly $480 million. Arthur didn't blink. He simply nodded, taking a slow sip of his water. Beatrice let out a small, satisfied sigh. Gable turned the thick parchment page. "And finally, to my daughter, Clara Jenkins." Clara leaned forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I leave the property known as Oakhaven, located in Schoharie County, New York, including all 50 acres of land, the farmhouse, and the outbuildings." Gable stopped reading and closed the leather-bound folder. Silence stretched across the room. Clara blinked, processing the words. That's it?" she whispered. Arthur let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Oakhaven? He gave you Oakhaven?" Beatrice looked confused. "Arthur, darling, what is Oakhaven? Another vacation home?" "Hardly," Arthur sneered, leaning over the table to lock eyes with Clara. "It's a dilapidated dairy farm he bought back in the 80s. The soil is contaminated from an old chemical runoff. The farmhouse has been abandoned for 30 years, and the barn is a stiff breeze away from collapsing. But that's not even the best part." Arthur turned to the lawyer. "Richard, tell her about the tax situation." Gable sighed heavily, looking at Clara with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Miss Jenkins, it is my duty to inform you that the property comes with a significant liability. Your father stopped paying the property taxes on Oakhaven 15 years ago. The county has placed several liens on the estate. To take ownership, you will inherit the debt. It currently stands at $43,212. The blood drained from Clara's face. The room began to spin. "He left me a debt. I don't have $43,000. I don't even have $4,000. It's a master stroke, really, Arthur chuckled, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. The old man hated you right up until the end. He couldn't just write you out of the will. That would give you grounds to contest it. So he gave you an anchor, a worthless, toxic farm that will bankrupt you before the year is out. He walked around the table and stopped behind Clara's chair, leaning down so only she could hear his cold whisper. I'll tell you what, little sister. I'm feeling generous. I'll buy the property from you right now for $1 single. I'll absorb the tax debt just so the county doesn't auction it off and drag the Pendleton name through the local mud. Sign it over, walk away, and go back to your pathetic life. Clara looked at the gleaming silver pen Arthur tossed onto the table in front of her. She thought about her tiny apartment in Queens. She thought about the collection notices piling up in her mailbox. It would be so easy to sign, to walk away. But as she looked at Arthur's smug reflection in the polished wood of the table, a sudden, unfamiliar surge of defiance ignited in her chest. Harrison Pendleton was a ruthless businessman, a titan of industry who never did anything by accident. Why Oakhaven? Why force her to inherit a ruined farm and a tax bill? There had to be a reason, and she would be damned if she let Arthur win this easily. Keep your dollar, Arthur, Clara said, her voice shaking but surprisingly clear. She picked up the pen and handed it back to him. I'm keeping the farm. Arthur's smile vanished. You're a fool, Clara. The county will seize it in 90 days, and they'll come after your personal wages for the difference. Have fun in the dirt. He stormed out, Beatrice trailing closely behind like a well-dressed shadow. Gable handed Clara a heavy iron key ring containing 3 rusted keys. Good luck, Miss Jenkins, the lawyer murmured softly. You are going to need it. The drive up Interstate 88 toward Cobleskill was a bleak journey through relentless, driving rain. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, hanging low over the Catskill Mountains. Clara gripped the steering wheel of her 2010 Honda Civic until her knuckles turned white, her mind racing with a terrifying cocktail of anxiety and regret. What had she done? She had let her pride dictate her financial future. She was a pediatric nurse, not a farmer. She knew nothing about property law, liens, or land management. When she finally pulled off the county highway onto the unmarked, rutted dirt road that led to Oakhaven, the reality of her inheritance struck her like a physical blow. The property wasn't just dilapidated, it was a corpse of a homestead. Overgrown briar bushes choked the entrance, scraping against the sides of her car with awful, screeching sounds. The main farmhouse sat on a small rise, silhouetted against the stormy sky. Its roof sagged dangerously in the middle like a broken spine. Most of the windows were shattered, peering out into the gloom like empty, hollow eyes. The porch had completely rotted through. Arthur hadn't been exaggerating. The place was a total loss. Clara parked the car and stepped out into the freezing mud, pulling the collar of her raincoat up around her neck. "Okay, Harrison," she muttered to the wind. "What is the joke? What am I supposed to find here?" She carefully navigated the treacherous porch and used the largest rusted key to unlock the front door. It swung open with a dreadful groan. Inside, the house smelled of animal urine, damp wood, and decades of neglect. Graffiti covered the peeling wallpaper, the work of local teenagers using the abandoned Pendleton place as a party spot. The floors were strewn with broken beer bottles and moldy debris. There was nothing of value here. No hidden safe behind a painting, no antique furniture. Just trash. Defeated, Clara stepped back out into the rain. The storm was intensifying, thunder rumbling low and heavy across the valley. She looked out toward the massive, brooding structure about 50 yards behind the house. The barn. Unlike the house, the barn had a surprisingly sturdy look to it. It was built from thick, old-growth timber, the kind of wood that seasoned and hardened like iron over the centuries. Hoping to find at least some salvageable antique farm equipment, maybe an old plough or anvil she could sell to an antique dealer to cover a fraction of the tax debt, Clara pulled her hood tight and jogged through the mud toward the massive sliding wooden doors. It took all her strength to pry the heavy barn doors apart. As she slipped inside, she was immediately enveloped in a suffocating gloom. The air was thick with the scent of dry rot, hay dust, and rusted metal. Rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof with a deafening roar, drowning out the sound of her own breathing. She switched on her heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the floating dust motes. The interior was vast, built for heavy agricultural work. In the center of the dirt floor sat the rusted, hulking remains of a 1930s McCormick Deering Tantanos tractor, its massive iron wheels sunk deep into the earth. Stacks of rotting hay bales lined the walls, alongside broken wooden crates and rusted lengths of chain. Clara began to walk around the perimeter, shining her light into the dark corners. Nothing. Just rusted junk. Her heart sank, a cold, heavy lump forming in her stomach. Arthur had been right. She was a fool. She had inherited a graveyard. A sudden, violent crack of thunder shook the entire structure. Clara jumped, dropping her flashlight. As it hit the ground, the beam illuminated a strange anomaly beneath the massive rear wheel of the rusted tractor. Clara frowned, picking up the light and stepping closer. The dirt floor beneath the heavy iron wheel wasn't flat. It was bowing inward. She knelt in the dirt, ignoring the dampness seeping through her jeans. She brushed away a thick layer of topsoil and dried hay. Her fingers scraped against something hard and unnaturally smooth. It wasn't stone, it wasn't hard-packed earth. It was concrete. Why would there be a perfectly smooth square of poured concrete buried 2 feet beneath the dirt floor of an old dairy barn? Adrenaline began to pump through her veins, chasing away the freezing chill of the damp air. Clara stood up and frantically searched the perimeter of the barn until she found a heavy, rusted iron crowbar leaning against a rotting support beam. She ran back to the center of the barn and began to dig. She swung the crowbar like a pickaxe, breaking up decades of compacted dirt, rocks, and debris. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her arms aching with the effort. But she couldn't stop. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. She cleared an area about 4 feet wide, revealing the edges of the concrete slab. And then her crowbar struck metal with a sharp, echoing clang. Clara dropped to her knees again, frantically clearing the dirt away with her bare hands, her fingernails tearing and bleeding against the rough stones. Buried in the center of the concrete, completely flush with the floor, was a heavy, circular iron plate. It looked like a manhole cover, but much older, secured by a massive, rusted iron ring. Harrison Pendleton hadn't bought this farm to raise dairy cows. Clara grabbed the iron ring with both hands and pulled. It didn't budge. The rust of 30 years held it fast. Gritting her teeth, she took the crowbar, wedged the flattened end under the lip of the iron plate, and threw her entire body weight onto the handle. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a dying animal, the rust broke. The heavy iron plate shifted, emitting a foul puff of stale, ancient air that smelled of ozone and deep earth. Using the crowbar as a lever, Clara slowly heaved the heavy cover to the side. It landed on the dirt with a heavy thud. Clara grabbed her flashlight and crawled to the edge of the dark, gaping hole. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing a narrow, spiraling staircase carved directly into the bedrock, descending deep into the earth below the barn. The steps were perfectly uniform, entirely out of place for a simple farm root cellar. She sat back on her heels, the roar of the storm outside completely forgotten. Her pulse drummed a frantic rhythm in her ears. Arthur and Beatrice were sitting in their multi-million-dollar penthouse right now, laughing at her, completely unaware of what lay buried beneath the contaminated soil of Schoharie County. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Clara Jenkins gripped her flashlight, placed her hand against the cold stone wall, and began her descent into the dark. The air grew noticeably colder with every step Clara took down the spiraling stone staircase. The heavy scent of damp earth and rot from the barn above faded, replaced by the sterile metallic tang of ozone and aged paper. Her flashlight beam bounced off the sheer, impeccably carved bedrock walls, revealing a descent that went at least 40 feet below the Schoharie County topsoil. At the bottom of the stairs, the narrow passage opened into a small, concrete antechamber. Dead ahead stood a massive, brushed steel vault door. It looked like it belonged in the basement of a Swiss bank, not buried beneath a decaying dairy farm. There was no electronic keypad, no biometric scanner to short-circuit or hack. In the center of the heavy steel face was a single, large mechanical keyhole. Clara's hands trembled as she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the heavy iron keyring Richard Gable had given her. There were 3 keys. She had used the first on the farmhouse. The second was a long, intricate brass skeleton key that looked entirely out of place next to her modern car fob. She inserted the brass key into the vault door. It slid in with a satisfying, oiled smoothness. She turned it, gripping the heavy steel wheel handle with her other hand, and pulled. With a deep, pneumatic hiss, the pressurized seal broke. The heavy door swung open on perfectly balanced hinges, revealing a cavernous room bathed in the sudden, flickering glow of motion sensor fluorescent lights. Clara stepped over the threshold, her breath catching in her throat. The room was a state-of-the-art, climate-controlled archive. The walls were lined with towering rows of fireproof filing cabinets. Dehumidifiers hummed quietly in the corners, drawing power from what appeared to be a massive off-grid battery bank connected to a geothermal generator. But it was the center of the room that drew her eye. Sitting atop a solid mahogany desk was a single, sealed manila envelope. Next to it rested a sleek, black leather briefcase. Clara slowly approached the desk. Written across the front of the envelope, in the sharp, aggressive cursive she recognized from her few miserable childhood birthday cards, were 2 words: for Clara. She broke the wax seal and unfolded the thick, cream-colored stationery. Clara, if you are reading this, then you possess the one trait your brother lacks: grit. Arthur is a creature of comfort. He would never step foot in the mud of Oakhaven, let alone possess the sheer will to dig beneath it. I knew the only way to keep this out of his hands was to bury it in the one place he would never look, and entrust it to the one person he fundamentally underestimates. Pendleton Holdings is a lie, Clara. My entire legacy is built on a theft that has haunted me for 40 years. Before I was a billionaire, I was a failing chemical engineer. The revolutionary water purification patent that launched my empire, the technology that currently sustains 80% of Pendleton's global contracts, was not mine. It belonged to a brilliant, struggling mechanic from Queens. His name was William Jenkins, your grandfather. Clara gasped, dropping the letter to the desk. The room spun. William Jenkins. Her mother had always said her grandfather was a dreamer who died penniless and broken-hearted. She forced her shaking hands to pick the letter back up. I stole his blueprints, patented them under a shell corporation, and legally buried William until he couldn't afford to fight me. Your mother, Evelyn, found out decades later. She came to my office to blackmail me. Instead, we fell into a toxic, miserable affair that resulted in you. I paid her millions over the years to keep her quiet, but the guilt remained. 10 years ago, Arthur discovered the truth. Instead of making amends, my son orchestrated a cover-up, bribing officials and destroying public records to ensure that Jenkins' name was erased from history entirely. Arthur is a parasite, Clara. If he maintains control of the board, he will run the company into the ground, and thousands of innocent employees will suffer. Inside the filing cabinets, you will find the original, dated, handwritten blueprints, signed by William Jenkins. You will also find audio recordings and bank records proving Arthur's illegal cover-up. It is enough evidence to strip him of everything and send him to federal prison. Finally, the briefcase. You have suffered enough for my sins. Inside are $50 million in unregistered, tax-exempt municipal bearer bonds. They are untraceable and completely liquid. Pay your mother's debts. Take back what I stole from your family. Destroy Arthur before he destroys my company. May God forgive me, because I know you won't. Harrison Clara stared blindly at the wall, tears of rage and vindication hot on her cheeks. She wasn't just an unwanted mistake. She was the rightful heir to an empire. She reached over and popped the brass latches on the leather briefcase. It fell open, revealing neat, tightly bound stacks of pristine parchment bonds. Millions of dollars. Financial freedom. But as Clara looked from the money to the rows of filing cabinets containing the weaponized truth, the terrified, debt-ridden pediatric nurse vanished. In her place stood a woman ready for war. 3 weeks later, the sky over Schoharie County was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Arthur Pendleton stepped out of his chauffeur-driven Mercedes-Benz Maybach, his Italian leather Oxfords sinking instantly into the soft, unpaved dirt of the Oakhaven driveway. "This is absolutely barbaric," Beatrice complained, holding a silk scarf over her nose as she stepped out behind him. "Why are we here, Arthur? You said the county was seizing it." "They were supposed to," Arthur snarled, viciously buttoning his tailored jacket, "until someone anonymously paid off the $43,000 tax lien in full yesterday. I want to know where my pathetic sister found the money, and I want her off this land so I can bulldoze this eyesore." Richard Gable, looking deeply uncomfortable in his tweed suit, trailed behind them. "Arthur, I must advise you. She is the legal owner. You cannot force her to vacate." "I can do whatever I please, Richard," Arthur snapped, marching up the hill toward the barn. But as they crested the small ridge, Arthur stopped dead in his tracks. The scene before him made no sense. The briar bushes had been cleared. The rotting porch on the farmhouse had been entirely dismantled, and construction crews were already laying a new foundation. More shockingly, 2 massive, intimidating men in black tactical suits stood perfectly still on either side of the wide-open barn doors. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur demanded, marching up to the guards. "I am Arthur Pendleton. Step aside." "Let him in, boys." A calm, feminine voice echoed from the shadows of the barn. Arthur pushed past the guards, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The barn had been entirely gutted of its rotting hay and trash. Industrial floodlights illuminated the space. In the center of the room, sitting comfortably at a sleek, modern glass table that had been brought in just for this occasion, was Clara. She wasn't wearing frayed sweaters or faded jeans. She wore a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit that rivaled Beatrice's haute couture. A steaming cup of coffee rested next to a thick, bound leather folder. "Clara," Arthur said, masking his shock with a sneer, "playing dress-up. I see you found a loan shark, foolish enough to front you the tax money. It won't save you. I brought Richard to draft a final offer. $10,000, and you sign the deed over today." Clara took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes locking onto her brother with a cold, terrifying serenity. "Sit down, Arthur." "I will not." "I said sit down," Clara commanded, her voice cracking like a whip. The sheer authority in her tone caused Arthur's jaw to snap shut. Slowly, hesitantly, he pulled out a chair and sat. Beatrice and Gable hovered behind him. Clara slid the thick leather folder across the glass table. "Open it." Arthur scoffed, flipping the cover open. His eyes scanned the first page. It was a photocopy of a blueprint. He blinked, turning the page. Then he saw the signature, William Jenkins, 1982. All the blood drained from Arthur's face. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. He frantically flipped through the next pages, bank statements, wire transfers, internal memos with his own signature on them, detailing the destruction of the Jenkins files. "Where did you get this?" Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. He looked around the barn, his eyes finally landing on the open trap door and the stone staircase leading into the earth. "He buried it. That vindictive old bastard actually buried it." "He buried the truth," Clara corrected smoothly, "but he left me the shovel." Beatrice leaned over to look at the papers. "Arthur, what is this? What does this mean?" "It means," Clara said, addressing her sister-in-law directly, "that 80% of Pendleton Holdings' intellectual property is fraudulent. It means your husband committed federal corporate espionage, obstruction of justice, and wire fraud to cover it up. It means if I hand this folder to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the stock plummets to zero, and Arthur spends the next 20 years in a concrete cell. You little—" Arthur lunged across the table. Instantly, the two security guards were there, slamming Arthur forcefully back into his chair. Clara didn't even flinch. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Here is how this is going to work, Arthur. I have already contacted the board of directors. A private courier delivered a redacted version of these documents to them an hour ago." "You destroyed the company!" Arthur screamed, his composure entirely shattered. "No," Clara replied. "I saved it from you. The board has been informed that the rightful heir to the Jenkins patent is willing to grant Pendleton Holdings an exclusive, permanent license to continue using the technology. The company survives. The employees keep their jobs." She slid a single, crisp legal document across the table, along with a silver pen. "But the cost of that license is your absolute surrender," Clara continued, her voice devoid of any pity. "You will sign over all of your voting shares to me. You will resign as CEO, effective immediately, citing personal health reasons. You will vacate the Tribeca penthouse and the Southampton estate by Friday. You will walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back and whatever you manage to hide in your personal checking accounts. And if I refuse?" Arthur spat, though his eyes were wide with panic. "Then I walk out of this barn, drive to the FBI field office in Albany, and hand them the original audio recordings of you bribing a federal judge in 2015, Clara said, tapping the folder. "The choice is yours, brother. Poverty or prison." Silence descended on the barn, broken only by the distant sounds of the construction crew rebuilding the farmhouse. Arthur looked up at Richard Gable, desperate for an escape route. Gable stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked down at the documents, then up at Clara, a deep respect dawning in his elderly eyes. "Arthur," the lawyer said quietly, "I strongly advise you to sign the document." "You work for me," Arthur yelled. "I worked for your father," Gable corrected, "and it appears I now work for Miss Jenkins." Beatrice let out a strangled sob, realizing her life of luxury had just evaporated into the Shohari County air. Defeated, broken, and trembling with rage, Arthur Pendleton picked up the silver pen. He hesitated for one agonizing second before dragging his signature across the bottom line, signing away his fortune, his legacy, and his power. Clara took the paper back, checked the signature, and neatly placed it into her briefcase. She stood up, buttoning her suit jacket. "You can show yourselves out," Clara said, turning her back on them to walk toward the trapdoor. "I have a farm to rebuild. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in gold, but in the truth." Clara Jenkins walked into the fire of her family's betrayal and emerged an unstoppable force, proving that underestimating the outcast is a dangerous game. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life dramas.